Very good morning to you. Thank you very much for your time. Of course, Mpendulo, you have been calling for the scrapping of student historical debt for a while now. What is your initial immediate reaction to the minister's allocation of almost 100 million rands towards this?
Look, I think it's really a short-term solution to a long-term problem. It doesn't address the main problem we have here as a country. Because I think it's narrow, and with great respect to the office, it's narrow of the Ministry of Higher Education to say they're going to allocate close to 1 billion rand for historical debt. It leaves out a lot of problems. In fact, it adds to the problem in a sense. You understand? So going forward in 5 years from now or tomorrow and the next year, are they still going to add another 1 billion rand when we face historical debt again? So secondly to that, it narrows the confines of our problems to historical debt, and it doesn't focus on the logical conclusion of what we've been calling for. It's not only the historical debt that we've been calling for, but the issue of free education in our lifetime. And I think it's time we took an intellectual lens into viewing the problem of free education in the country, because it's been painted as a rascal movement or whatever it may be. It would be an investment in the country's economy in 5 years, 10 years from now. The more workforce you have, that will contribute either intellectually, economically, or otherwise. Only then are you benefiting for your country. So I'm not impressed or enticed by the contribution of the 1 billion rand to historical debt. In fact, I find it even more problematic because it means the minister knows what part of the problem is. So part of the problem is not historic debt. The bigger problem we're fighting here is the issue of free education in our lifetime. And by the way, I must fight this. It doesn't really serve the student to pay historical debt at this point in time. What serves the student more at this point in time is the issue of free education going forward. So, okay, fine, yes, I owe in the past, but going forward, are these students who have been paid for from 2018 who owed debt, are these students going to come back into the system next year? So that's the question we should be asking, not the question of whether do they owe 5 years from now. Yes, it's a fundamental and it's an important question to address, but the foremost question is to say, are they coming back into the system next year? Will they be leaving Wits University, UCT, UK, Beren, and Limpopo with their degrees? So let's not make short-term solutions for long-term problems. So that's my initial reaction to the 967 million grant to student historic debt.
So your initial reaction, of course, is then that the students aren't necessarily satisfied. How then do you think this money should have been allocated?
Okay, thanks for the question. The allocation of the money should not have been necessarily to student historical debt. We must be well aware that there's a Vice Chancellor's committee that sits around the country of every VC. And the Minister of Higher Education sits in that Vice Chancellor's committee. Not only that, but whenever a decision has to be made by the Minister of Higher Education, now and then the Minister of Higher Education has a responsibility to consult the relevant stakeholders, being universities in this case. So what the money should have been allocated to is future funding. In fact, I think the money in and of itself is part of the problem. The money in and of itself should have been used to say, okay, look, going forward, how do we fund education in South Africa, higher education, free higher education in South Africa? Because it was pronounced last year by the former president, Mr. Jacob Zuma, but it's still yet to kick in. They call it free education, which I think is part of the problem. So the money should have been allocated to future funding and not historic debt. And then a concession should have been made by universities in agreement with the Minister of Higher Education to say, okay, look, we're making a concession that students who owe historic debt will still be allowed to come back into the system. But in the now, the money we have is R1 billion so that these students conclude their degree. Then only then, like NSFAS has been known to be a payback scheme. So, okay, fine, the student will be funded for X number of years, and the student will pay X number of money when they start working. So the money should have been focused largely on saying, okay, fine, students need to graduate and they need to leave the system, not on historic debt, because it serves the little ends or the narrow ends of universities to say, okay, fine, universities are owed this much. The concession was supposed to be made by all universities with the minister to say, okay, fine, there's this number of students who are on NSFAS who owe this much. We'll make a concession for them. But going forward, we will pay for them in this regard.
Now, you've mentioned earlier that this is only somewhat of a short-term solution. Do you not then think that this is the first good step going forward?
No, I think it's a first step going backward, not forward.
How so?
And I'll explain how. So the issue of historic debt in our country is a long-standing one. It's not new. You didn't wake up today and found the history of historic debt and found it here. So it's been there. It's older than some of us, like the bond freeze and so forth and so on. So the core of the problem, the reason why I say it's a setback, it doesn't in any way address going forward. It doesn't in any way address it doesn't take the matter to its logical conclusion, being accessed in institutions of higher learning. So, for example, the students already, in that 52,000 plus that's been mentioned in the article, the students, I'm certain there's more than half at least, that's at home already because of historic debt. We had to fight against it at Wits University, and we demonstrated, and we got a concession from the Vice Chancellor and the management of students who owed 100,000 or less to be allowed to come back into the university. But those who owed more had to turn back and go home. And it's unfortunate that this was at NSFAS's fault and not their fault. But my point here, and when I say it's part of a step back, it's because there's victims already of this historic debt. Whether they pay this money or not, it doesn't matter now for someone who's at home. What matters is, are they coming back into the system next year? So if, say, maybe there's a student X who stays in rural Eastern Cape and has been paid for, this debt has been settled for last year or the year before, it's really immaterial on practical grounds. What's material is to say, are they coming back into the system next year to complete their degree? So that's how I see it as a step back. It would have been a step forward had it been that, okay, fine, students who don't have money now, students who are homeless now. Homelessness is a big issue, and I haven't had anything from the ministry saying, okay, fine, there's homelessness and students are sleeping in ground or in toilets and libraries and so forth. So we haven't had commentary on that. And there's abundant buildings all over the country. The ministry can literally invest in that. Say, okay, fine, they want to address homelessness. This R1 billion is going to go to student homelessness. Students become sophisticated hobos in universities across the country every day, and they become vulnerable to things like rape and robbery and all sorts of things. But my point here is to say the money wasn't focused at where it could have been most vital to use it.
Just very briefly before we wrap it up, Mpendulo, now the money has of course now been allocated. Where to from now? Is SASCO going to be raising these concerns and these points of dissatisfaction that you've just mentioned? As
SASCO, we have a social responsibility to continue problematizing the problem. We need to sharpen the contradictions of whatever policy decision the Ministry of Higher Education takes. We can't sit back and say, oh, okay, fine, they've added R1 billion to student debt. Look, at all levels, branch, provincial and regional and national levels, SASCO has a duty and responsibility to attack whatever attacks the students. And yes, to look at this with to look at the silver lining in the cloud, there is somewhat of a good that will assist that will assist in the allocation of this money, and that being the universities will be able to be operational, which I don't think they even need this money to be operational. Like, universities have diamond accounts and they have reserves that operate the money that is paid for by students. I mean, the money that is paid by students as fees doesn't even have to do anything with the operations of the university. So going forward, I think, look, we will welcome the money, obviously, because there's a number of students that we cannot overlook that are going to benefit from the money. But we have a responsibility to continue problematizing the problem. And this is a problem we need to somewhat start sharpening the contradictions around it. So, yes, there's money that's been allocated, but the contradiction in the money that's been allocated is A, B, and C.
Thank you very much for your time this morning. Mpendulo Mfeka from the SASCO chairperson, of course, at the Wits University. Their initial reaction, immediate reaction thereof, of over 960 million rand that is set to be allocated to scrap historical debt.